The air in the room was thick with anticipation. The cameras flashed, the audience held its breath, and the clock ticked down to the moment that would define this showdown. Joe Biden stood tall at the podium, his face a mask of calm determination. He looked out at the crowd, and then, in a voice steady but full of conviction, he spoke the words that no one was ready for. "If you're willing to play politics with the lives of millions," Biden said, pausing for effect, "then you're no better than a traitor to this country." The room went dead silent. You could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of his statement hanging in the air like a thunderstorm before the strike. And then it came. Ted Cruz's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "You're too blinded by nostalgia, Joe," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your so-called plan is a disaster for future generations. It's reckless, it's irresponsible, and it'll bankrupt America faster than you can say, Social Security." Biden didn't flinch. His gaze remained unwavering, locked on Cruz, while the audience could feel the intensity of the standoff. Cruz's words were meant to wound, to tear down. But Biden wasn't about to be rattled. "You'll sell out the American people for the sake of your politics, Cruz," Biden shot back, his voice growing stronger, his resolve sharpening. "You think cutting the lifeline for our elderly is going to make America stronger? You're wrong." The cameras zoomed in, capturing the raw emotion etched on both men's faces. Cruz's lip curled into a smirk, his confidence surging, while Biden's eyes flashed with the righteous fury of a man who had spent a lifetime fighting for the people. The tension in the room was palpable. It was a battle not just of words, but of values. A fight for the future of America. And as the two men stood there, locked in their ideological battle, one thing was certain. What happened next would rock America to its core. It wasn't just a debate. It was a battle over the very fabric of American life. The stakes were higher than the typical political game. For decades, Social Security had been the backbone of the American promise, a safety net that caught millions of people in their most vulnerable moments, ensuring that the elderly, the disabled, and the survivors of fallen workers could retire with dignity and security. For most Americans, it wasn't just a government program, it was an inextricable part of the American dream. Social Security had been signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935, during the Great Depression. At that time, America was facing one of the darkest economic chapters in its history. Tens of millions of people were out of work, families were desperate, and seniors were left to fend for themselves in their old age, often in poverty. Roosevelt's vision was simple: create a system where every American paid into a fund that would guarantee financial support in retirement, preventing elderly citizens from ending their days in misery. Fast forward to today. Social Security, despite its flaws, has been a lifeline for tens of millions of Americans. Over 60 million people rely on it every month, including 40 million seniors. That's 1 in every 5 Americans, including veterans, widows, children, and those with disabilities. It's not just a check, it's the difference between struggling to make ends meet and maintaining a semblance of dignity in old age. And yet, Cruz was standing in front of the American people, calling for drastic cuts. Under his plan, millions of seniors would face a future where their monthly checks weren't guaranteed, where the very programs designed to protect them were on the chopping block, all for the sake of balancing the budget. The impact would be catastrophic. Elderly Americans, already living on the edge, would face destitution, an economic nightmare none of them had bargained for. Biden had seen it firsthand. He knew the stories: families struggling to get by, seniors choosing between food and medicine, grandparents forced to go back to work at 75 just to survive. He had spent his career fighting for policies that would protect those people, the ones who had built America and deserved to retire with dignity. As Cruz's plan gained traction, Biden's voice grew more determined. "This is not just about numbers on a sheet," he had said in his opening statement. "This is about people. Real people, who've worked their entire lives and paid into this system. We cannot betray them now." The contrast was stark: Cruz, a man of ideology, willing to dismantle the social safety net for political gain, and Biden, standing as the last line of defense for the elderly and vulnerable. If Cruz had his way, millions would face a cruel future, dependent on private savings or charity for survival. If Biden succeeded, he would not only protect Social Security but expand it to ensure that future generations weren't left in the same perilous position. The debate wasn't just about numbers or policies, it was a referendum on America's soul. Who would we be as a nation? A place where the wealthy and powerful were protected at the expense of the vulnerable? Or a place where everyone, no matter their background, had a fair shot at a secure future? As the tension in the room reached its peak, the stakes couldn't have been clearer. Cruz's policies threatened to unravel the safety net that had protected generations of Americans. Biden's defense was the last hope for the elderly, an unwavering stand against the forces seeking to dismantle it. But would it be enough? What happened next would change the future of millions. Ted Cruz had long positioned himself as a champion of limited government, a true believer in the gospel of fiscal conservatism. His speeches were filled with fiery rhetoric about slashing the size of government, trimming the fat, and getting the nation's finances in order. But if you looked beyond the slogans and the soundbites, his record told a different story. Cruz had built a career out of political grandstanding, putting ideology over people, winning applause from the far right while leaving the most vulnerable Americans in the dust. His rise to national prominence began with a filibuster in 2013, a spectacle that would become one of his defining moments. For 21 hours, Cruz held the Senate floor in a futile, theatrical attempt to defund Obamacare. It was a dramatic stunt, a display of political posturing that gained him notoriety among conservatives but also left a trail of collateral damage. In the process, he failed to accomplish anything tangible, except to showcase his willingness to block essential programs for political theater. Cruz didn't care if his filibuster hurt everyday Americans. He was willing to sacrifice the needs of the nation for the sake of political purity. His attacks on Social Security followed a similar script. Cruz didn't hesitate to suggest that Social Security was nothing more than an outdated system, one that needed to be reformed. To him, the elderly weren't people who had worked hard for decades, they were just a burden on the economy. His arguments echoed the same tired rhetoric that had been used to justify slashing vital programs. Social Security was unsustainable, it was bankrupting the nation, and it needed to be reformed for future generations. Of course, what Cruz never seemed to acknowledge was that the real, unsustainable threat wasn't Social Security, it was the massive tax cuts he and his allies had given to the wealthy and corporations, which had drained the country's coffers without creating any lasting economic benefit for the average American. But Cruz wasn't interested in real solutions. His ideology was a shield, one that allowed him to ignore the human cost of his policies. He refused to consider the impact that cuts to Social Security would have on the elderly, the disabled, the children of deceased workers, those who depended on the program to survive. To Cruz, these people weren't the heart of America, they were an inconvenience. He had spent his career attacking the very programs that supported the most vulnerable in society. And yet, when it suited him, he'd found no problem with supporting government bailouts for corporations, or tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy. It wasn't about principles for Cruz, it was about power and positioning. He had no real interest in saving America, he was interested in appeasing his wealthy donors and pleasing his political base. At every turn, he chose the path of political expediency over moral responsibility. And now, Cruz had set his sights on Social Security, one of the most sacred pillars of American social policy. He wasn't content to let the system remain intact, he wanted to gut it, cutting benefits and restricting access under the guise of saving the program for future generations. In his eyes, the elderly, the disabled, and the working poor weren't deserving of the safety net they had paid into. He wasn't interested in reforming the system to make it more sustainable. He wanted to erase it, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a shell of the promise it had once been. His ideology had always been about idealism, never about practicality. It was about making ideological statements, not solving real problems. Cruz wasn't out to fix America's fiscal problems, he was out to make a name for himself on the backs of the people who needed Social Security most. And while Cruz positioned himself as the champion of the common man, his actions had shown that he was no ally to the American worker. His disdain for Social Security wasn't just ideological, it was personal. The elderly were the very people Cruz seemed to dismiss at every turn, labeling them as lazy or dependent. He saw them as obstacles to his vision of America, one where the rich got richer and the rest were left to fend for themselves. For Cruz, it wasn't about securing a future for those who had spent their lives contributing to society. It was about scoring political points and proving his ideological purity to his base, even if that meant condemning millions of Americans to an uncertain future. But there was a deeper contradiction at the heart of Cruz's crusade. As much as he railed against entitlements, he had no qualms about benefiting from the system when it suited him. Cruz, like many of his colleagues, had enjoyed the perks of government service, handsomely paid positions, subsidized health care, and retirement benefits. But when it came to the American people, he was willing to throw them under the bus. His political gamesmanship was a stark reminder of how easily the powerful could look the other way when it came to the welfare of the most vulnerable. Time and time again, Cruz's record had shown a man willing to sacrifice the needs of the nation for the sake of his own ambitions. His latest attack on Social Security was just another chapter in a long saga of political gamesmanship, one that had left the most vulnerable behind. As the stakes of the debate grew higher, the audience couldn't help but wonder, would Cruz's callous disregard for the elderly and vulnerable come back to haunt him? Would his ideological purity finally be exposed for what it was, a dangerous path that ignored the human cost? The stage was set. And Cruz, the man who had sacrificed principle for politics time and again, was about to face the consequences. But how far would he go? How much damage could one man do before the truth could no longer be ignored? The battle for America's soul was just beginning. For Joe Biden, Social Security wasn't just a policy, it was personal. Growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Biden saw firsthand the struggles of working-class families. His father, a man of deep integrity and unwavering work ethic, spent most of his life struggling to keep his family afloat. In a city battered by industrial decline, the Biden family wasn't immune to the harsh realities of financial insecurity. The fear of losing what little they had loomed over them like a shadow. Joe's early years were shaped by this struggle. His father, a hard-working man who always believed in the American dream, was forced to take jobs that didn't pay enough to meet the needs of the family. Yet, through it all, he instilled in Joe a deep respect for those who worked to build this country. "Keep your chin up, Joey," his father would tell him. "There's dignity in hard work." It was this sense of dignity, this deep-rooted belief that every person deserved respect, that would define Biden's career, and his fight for the most vulnerable. Joe Biden had never forgotten where he came from. The people of Scranton, the factory workers, the teachers, the retirees, had been his community. He understood their dreams, their fears, and most of all, their need for security. In the small kitchens and tight-knit neighborhoods of Scranton, where families gathered for Sunday dinners and shared what little they had, Biden learned what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. It was about caring for the people who stood beside you, the ones who depended on you when the world was falling apart. When he entered public service, it was with a sense of duty and compassion that many of his peers lacked. As a young senator, Biden quickly made a name for himself as a fighter for the middle class. He wasn't interested in making deals with the corporate elites or advancing his own agenda. He wanted to make sure that working families had a voice, that the elderly weren't left behind, and that the promises made to them were kept. Biden's understanding of Social Security was rooted in his own experience. As a senator, he worked tirelessly to defend and expand the program, knowing how much it meant to the millions of Americans who relied on it. He had seen the faces of seniors who depended on Social Security checks to survive, and he knew how fragile that safety net was. Biden didn't just see Social Security as a line item in a budget, he saw it as a lifeline for millions of Americans. In 1972, when he was just starting his career in Congress, Biden was a vocal advocate for protecting Social Security benefits. Over the years, as a member of the Senate, he fought against any attempt to reduce those benefits, pushing back against conservative proposals that would have gutted the program. His stance on Social Security was never just about politics, it was about protecting the values that had shaped his own life, values of fairness, empathy, and a sense of shared responsibility. Biden's empathy for the elderly and the vulnerable wasn't born out of a desire to win political points, it was a direct result of his own life experiences. He saw the sacrifice of his mother, who worked tirelessly to make ends meet, and his father, who never gave up despite the constant setbacks. He saw the elderly in his neighborhood who were struggling to pay for their prescriptions, who were counting on Social Security to make it through the month. For Biden, Social Security wasn't just a policy proposal, it was a moral issue. His work as vice president further cemented his reputation as a defender of the elderly and vulnerable. In 2010, during the Obama administration, Biden worked to protect Social Security from the threats posed by those who wanted to privatize it or cut benefits. He understood the gravity of the fight. It wasn't just about preserving a program, it was about ensuring that the promise of security and dignity for the elderly remained unbroken. Over the years, Biden's commitment to Social Security became a cornerstone of his political identity. He made it clear that no matter the cost, he would fight to preserve the program and make sure that future generations of seniors were taken care of. His message resonated with millions of Americans, especially those who had seen firsthand what happens when social safety nets are weakened. To them, Biden wasn't just a politician, he was a protector, someone who would never abandon them in their time of need. As he stepped onto the stage to face Cruz in this high-stakes battle, Biden knew the gravity of the moment. It wasn't just about the policy, this was about something deeper, something that went to the heart of what America stood for. Cruz's plan wasn't just a budgetary proposal, it was a direct attack on the values that Biden had spent his life fighting for. Cruz wanted to dismantle the very system that had helped generations of Americans achieve a secure retirement. And for Biden, this was personal. Biden didn't see Social Security as a political pawn to be bargained over. He saw it as the bedrock of America's commitment to its people, a promise that, no matter what happened, seniors would not be abandoned. To Biden, that promise was sacred. And now, as Cruz unleashed his rhetoric about cutting benefits and undermining the program, Biden stood as the last line of defense. He had spent his life fighting for the people, and this was his moment to make sure that their voices were heard. In that moment, as the cameras flashed and the audience watched, Biden was reminded of the people he had fought for all his life, the workers, the seniors, the families struggling to get by. He thought of Scranton, of the lessons his father had taught him, and of the countless Americans who depended on him to keep the promises made to them. This was not just about policy, it was about preserving the very soul of the nation. And as Biden prepared to face Cruz in the next round of this fierce battle, he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't just fighting for Social Security, he was fighting for America's future, for the values that made this country great. And he wouldn't back down. The room buzzed with anticipation as Cruz leaned into the microphone, his face a mask of contempt. His words were sharp, designed to cut deep. This proposal you're pushing, Biden, it's reckless. It's dangerous. You're promising something you can't deliver. You're bankrupting future generations with this fantasy that we can just keep kicking the can down the road. Cruz's voice rose, matching the intensity of his words. The crowd watched, enraptured by the high-stakes clash. He was playing his usual game, an attack on Biden's character, on his policies, and on the very foundation of what Biden had spent a lifetime defending. The truth is, Cruz continued, you're taking from the young and the unborn to prop up a broken system. Social Security. It's a pyramid scheme that we cannot sustain any longer. You're fooling people into thinking that your promises can be kept, when in reality, it's an economic time bomb ready to explode. The insult hung in the air like smoke, a calculated blow designed to rattle Biden's resolve. But Biden didn't flinch. He didn't even move. His response was calm, measured, yet unwavering. What's dangerous, Senator, is the idea that we should cut the lifeline for millions of Americans, seniors who've spent their lives working hard, paying into the system, and now you want to take it away from them because it doesn't fit your ideology. The American people deserve better than that. Biden's voice carried across the room, steady and powerful. You're talking about balancing budgets on the backs of our most vulnerable citizens. You're talking about dismantling a program that has been there for generations to ensure that our seniors can live with dignity in their later years. And you want to call that unsustainable? I'll tell you what's unsustainable: allowing the rich to keep their tax breaks while cutting the safety net that millions depend on. The audience shifted in their seats, the air crackling with the tension between the two men. Cruz's face reddened with frustration as Biden continued, his voice never wavering, his words cutting through the noise of Cruz's attacks. You want to talk about the future of America, Ted? Then listen closely. If you succeed in stripping Social Security, you're not saving anything. You're throwing away the very promise that makes this country what it is. A promise that no matter your background, no matter your income, we take care of our own. Biden's eyes never left Cruz's as he delivered the line. If you want to talk about the future, look at the people you're willing to sacrifice. For a moment, Cruz seemed taken aback. His jaw clenched, eyes narrowing. He couldn't let this stand. His next attack was even sharper, aimed at Biden's integrity. You call yourself a man of the people, Joe, Cruz sneered. But all you're doing is putting the country deeper in debt, burdening our children with the consequences of your incompetence. You're holding us hostage to a system that's unsustainable. You want to bankrupt this country? Then keep defending a program that's headed for collapse. The insult was a direct hit. Cruz was trying to provoke Biden, to shake him from his calm. He wanted Biden to show the anger that could make him seem unfit for the role of leader. But Biden remained cool, unfazed, his response measured yet heavy with the weight of decades of experience. You can stand up here all day and scream about deficits, Ted, but you know as well as I do that Social Security isn't the problem. The problem is the billions in tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. The problem is the corporations that hide their profits overseas, while our working families pay the price. You're not worried about the future, you're worried about defending a system that benefits the rich while the rest of us pay for it. Cruz's face twisted into a mask of irritation. He had expected this. The back and forth was going exactly as he had hoped, but now, as the crowd murmured, he realized that Biden's calm was turning the tide. The audience wasn't reacting the way Cruz had anticipated, they weren't rallying behind him. Biden's words were resonating, cutting through the noise with precision. Cruz tried to regain his footing, his tone growing harsher. You're delusional if you think your vision for Social Security is sustainable, Joe. Your fixes aren't solutions, they're just more of the same reckless spending that's going to leave our kids and grandkids drowning in debt. I'm not the one selling them a false promise. Biden's gaze never wavered as he took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before delivering his next blow. Let me tell you something, Ted, Biden said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 truths. There's nothing reckless about taking care of people who've spent their entire lives building this country. Nothing reckless about making sure that no American has to choose between food and medicine. And nothing reckless about protecting the people who've paid into a system their whole lives with the understanding that it would be there when they needed it. The room was still. Cruz's attempt to goad Biden had failed. The truth was inescapable. The emotional stakes were higher now than ever before. The fate of millions, those who relied on Social Security for their dignity and survival, hung in the balance. And yet, Cruz wasn't done. He knew his plan was crumbling, and he'd stop at nothing to tear Biden down. But Biden's composure was a strength, his calm, his conviction, and his ability to speak directly to the American people, not just to score political points. As Cruz continued his fiery accusations, Biden stood his ground. The insults were flying, but Biden's resolve was unshakable. The clash had moved from ideological to personal, and the stakes could not have been higher. It was no longer just a debate about numbers and policies, it was a battle for the soul of America. Behind the words, behind the rhetoric, one thing was crystal clear, the future of millions was on the line. And what happened next could change everything. The tension in the room was palpable. It felt as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Cruz had thrown his most potent attacks, and Biden, calm and composed, had parried every blow. But now, Biden was ready to strike, ready to take this fight to a place where Cruz could no longer retreat. Biden took a slow breath, his gaze unwavering as he looked directly at Cruz. The room fell silent, the audience sensing that something significant was about to happen. Cruz's smug expression remained for a moment, but Biden wasn't done. "Senator," Biden began, his voice cutting through the growing tension, "you've made a lot of noise about deficits. About unsustainable spending. But here's the truth you're ignoring." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to hang in the air. Cruz shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in momentum but unwilling to show weakness. Biden's eyes softened, and his voice dropped, a clear shift from the fiery rhetoric of his opponent. He wasn't angry, he was measured, precise, and powerful. "The truth is, Senator, it's not the people who've worked their whole lives, the people who've paid into Social Security, who are the problem. It's the rich and powerful, the corporations that don't pay their fair share, that's where the real problem lies." He let those words sit for a moment, watching Cruz, who was suddenly less sure of himself, his posture stiffening. "But let's talk about the people you're so eager to throw under the bus. The elderly Americans who rely on Social Security to survive." Biden's voice grew stronger, but there was no anger, just a deep, quiet conviction that only someone who had spent his life fighting for the forgotten could possess. "You talk about sustainability, but let me tell you something, Ted. What's really unsustainable is the idea that we can turn our backs on people who've spent their whole lives building this country, working jobs, paying taxes, raising families, only to see their hard-earned benefits taken away at the whim of political ideology." Biden's eyes locked onto Cruz. "These aren't just numbers on a sheet, Senator. These are real people. You want to talk about what's unsustainable? Let me tell you about one of those people." Biden's voice didn't rise, he didn't need to yell. He simply spoke with the authority that only comes from years of fighting for the most vulnerable. A woman named Margaret, 78 years old, living in Delaware. She worked as a teacher for 35 years, taught generations of kids in a small, public school. Her pension wasn't enough to cover her expenses, so she depends on Social Security to make ends meet. Margaret, like millions of others, worked hard every day of her life. And now she's facing the cold reality that her benefits might be slashed because politicians like you think it's okay to balance the budget on her back. Margaret's been struggling to afford her medications for diabetes. She's not asking for a handout, she's asking for what she's earned, what she's paid into all these years. There was a beat of silence as Biden let that sink in. His voice was steady, but it had weight. The room was still, hanging on his every word. He continued, the words coming slow but deliberate. "And then there's Charlie. 81 years old, a Navy vet. After serving his country, he came home and worked in a factory for 40 years. Charlie's been living off of his Social Security for years now. He can't walk without help. But even with his health declining, Charlie makes sure to send money every month to his daughter, who's struggling to raise her kids. He's not looking for praise, Ted. He's just trying to get by. And now, because of people like you, Charlie's future is at risk." The audience was quiet, eyes trained on Biden as he continued to paint these portraits, one after another. Every word cut deeper than any attack Cruz had made. Biden was painting a picture that Cruz couldn't possibly hope to erase. These weren't just numbers, these were people with names, with faces, and with real lives that were on the line. Biden's gaze shifted back to Cruz, his voice growing colder but still steady. "And you want to tell me that those people, those workers, those veterans, those teachers, should have to pay for your tax cuts for the rich? That they're the ones who should bear the brunt of the cuts, all in the name of fiscal responsibility? Let me tell you something, Ted. That's not responsibility. That's greed. And it's cruel." He paused, his eyes now hard, staring directly at Cruz. You want to talk about the future? Fine. Let's talk about the future. The future of a country where we leave our elderly behind. The future of a country where we turn our backs on those who've worked their whole lives and tell them that their dignity doesn't matter anymore. Is that the future you want, Ted? Because if you succeed, that's what we're heading toward. And no amount of political gamesmanship can change that. Biden's words hit with the force of a freight train. Cruz's expression had shifted from arrogance to defensiveness. He shifted in his seat, clearly rattled, but his mind was still trying to catch up with Biden's calculated onslaught. Biden didn't let up. And let's not forget, Ted, the responsibility we all have as public servants. You call yourself a public servant, but you're no servant to the people if you're willing to gut the very programs that keep them alive. You don't protect America by cutting the lifeline for millions, you protect America by honoring the promises we made to our people. You protect America by standing up for the elderly, the sick, and the vulnerable. He let the silence linger, watching as Cruz struggled for a response, his hands gripping the podium in front of him. The audience was still, the energy in the room shifting dramatically. Biden had taken control of the stage. He had turned the debate upside down. He wasn't just arguing policy anymore, he was making it personal. And in doing so, he had become the undeniable hero of this fight. You can talk about deficits, Senator Cruz, Biden said, his voice lowering again, quieter now, but heavier than ever. But you can't put a price tag on human dignity. The room was stunned. The tension was so thick it felt like it would snap at any moment. Cruz, who had come in swinging with his attacks, was now stammering, his confidence unraveling in front of the entire nation. Biden, with that one final, quiet statement, had not only turned the debate on its head, he had flipped the entire narrative. Cruz's arrogance had met its match, and the audience knew it. This wasn't just a policy disagreement anymore. This was a battle of values, and Biden had just shown the world exactly what those values were. The room erupted into quiet murmurs as Biden stood tall, his eyes still locked on Cruz, waiting for the opponent to recover, but knowing the battle had already been won. Within hours, Twitter was ablaze with praise for Biden's performance. Cruz's plan? A distant memory. The political world had just witnessed a shift, a seismic change in the way America viewed the future of Social Security. What had started as a debate over policy had transformed into a cultural moment. And it was clear, Biden had come out on top. Hashtags like #BidenWins, #Save Social Security, and #StandWithBiden quickly trended, filling the digital airwaves with a wave of support. Social media users across the country flooded the internet with their reactions, tweets, posts, memes, and videos, celebrating Biden's unflinching defense of the American people. The narrative had shifted from Cruz's attacks on Social Security to a public embrace of Biden's vision for the future. What had once seemed like a political showdown had evolved into something much bigger, a movement. In the hours after the debate, public figures from all walks of life took to social media to weigh in. Celebrities, political commentators, and even pundits who had remained neutral before the event were now declaring their support for Biden. Actor and activist Mark Ruffalo tweeted, "Biden just showed us what true leadership looks like. Standing up for the vulnerable, protecting the elderly, this is what America is supposed to be about." #BidenWins, #Save Social Security. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had long been an advocate for expanding Social Security, joined in with her own message of support. Biden's defense of Social Security was the moral high ground we needed to see. Ted Cruz's plan? It's not just wrong, it's dangerous. #Save Social Security, #Biden is right. Even more surprising, Cruz's supporters were now scrambling to defend him in the face of Biden's overwhelming popularity. The right-wing talking heads who had been so confident in Cruz's victory began to hedge their statements. Fox News' Laura Ingraham, who had been an enthusiastic cheerleader for Cruz's position, found herself in a difficult position. It's undeniable that Biden's emotional appeal resonated with the public tonight, she conceded on air, her tone faltering. But the question remains, Can his policies withstand the economic challenges of the future? The media shifted its focus almost immediately. News outlets, from CNN to the New York Times, reframed the debate. Where Cruz had once been presented as the challenger with fresh ideas, he was now portrayed as out of touch, his economic plans labeled as reckless. The headlines told the story: Biden's historic defense of Social Security, a win for the people, and Cruz's plan to cut Social Security backfires in historic debate. No longer was Cruz the voice of fiscal responsibility, he was the villain, the man willing to sacrifice the vulnerable for his own ideological purity. The fact that Biden had remained calm in the face of Cruz's escalating attacks only made his performance more remarkable. His composure was not only admirable, it was a sharp contrast to Cruz's increasingly frustrated and aggressive tone. Cruz, once so confident in his arguments, was now seen as unraveling. His credibility, once bolstered by years of politicking, began to fray in real time, as voters across the country recognized the moral depth of Biden's stance. Cruz had failed to do what he had set out to do, dismantle the safety net for millions of Americans. Instead, Biden had turned the tables, not just defending the program, but making it clear that any attack on Social Security was an attack on America's most vulnerable citizens. But it wasn't just the politicians and celebrities who took notice. Everyday Americans flooded social media with personal stories of their own struggles. They shared photos of their grandparents, their parents, and themselves, the people who would suffer if Cruz's policies became reality. "I'm 72 years old. Social Security is my lifeline," one user tweeted. "Biden gets it. Cruz doesn't. #Biden wins." By the time the dust had settled, it was clear, Cruz's plan had been soundly defeated in the court of public opinion. The story of the debate wasn't about the specifics of fiscal policy, it was about values. Biden had framed Social Security not as a line-item expense but as a moral commitment to the American people, to those who had spent their lives working hard and now depended on the promise of security in their later years. He had won the debate by tapping into something far greater than partisan politics, he had tapped into the heart of what America stood for. And with Biden's win came a surge of hope. The sense of vindication was palpable as the public rallied behind the idea that the most vulnerable in society deserved protection. That Social Security wasn't just a program, it was a promise made to every American who worked for a living, every family that had sacrificed to build a future for the next generation. Biden's approval rating soared in the wake of the debate. Political analysts marveled at the way he had flipped the script, turning what had initially seemed like a vulnerable position into a resounding victory. According to one poll conducted by Gallup, Biden's approval had jumped by 10 points in just 48 hours, his highest rating in months. Meanwhile, Cruz's approval plummeted. What had seemed like an attack on an aging system now felt like an attack on the American people themselves. In the weeks that followed, the media continued to reflect on the lasting impact of the debate. While Cruz tried to regain ground with his base, his credibility was damaged beyond repair. Biden, on the other hand, was now viewed as the defender of Social Security, a champion for the elderly and working Americans. Politicians from both sides of the aisle took notice, with several Republican senators backing away from Cruz's position on Social Security cuts, fearing the political fallout from supporting such a controversial stance. For the first time in a long while, the American public was engaged, not just in a political fight, but in a conversation about values. Biden had won not just a debate, but a victory for the American people. And in doing so, he had redefined what it meant to fight for Social Security, not as a policy, but as a moral obligation. The shockwaves from that night rippled through the political world, and the truth was clear, the villain's power had diminished, while the hero's approval skyrocketed. And the battle for Social Security, for the soul of America, had only just begun. As the debate drew to a close, the weight of the moment hung in the air. The noise of the room faded, and in its place, a singular truth stood clear: this wasn't just about policy. It wasn't about figures on a budget sheet, or complex economic calculations. This was about something far deeper, a fight for the values that define who we are as a country. Biden, standing tall at the podium, turned to face the camera, his eyes soft but resolute. He spoke not as a politician, but as a man who had dedicated his life to fighting for the people, the ones who built this country, who worked every day with the understanding that their government would take care of them when they needed it most. You've heard the numbers, the arguments, the political rhetoric, Biden began, his voice calm but heavy with conviction. But let me tell you something that goes beyond all that. Social Security is more than just a program. It's a promise. A promise that when you work hard, when you sacrifice for your family, you'll have something to rely on in your later years. A promise that no matter who you are or where you come from, you'll never be left to struggle alone in your time of need. He paused, letting the words settle in. His gaze softened as he thought of the millions of people who relied on Social Security, people who worked their entire lives, only to face the uncertainty of retirement. He thought of the seniors in Delaware, the teachers, the factory workers, the veterans, all the people who had trusted that the promise made to them would be kept. I've seen it firsthand, Biden continued, his voice firm now, the look in people's eyes when they talk about the fear of losing what they've worked so hard for. It's not just a financial concern. It's a question of dignity. A question of respect. Because when we take care of our elderly, when we honor the promise of Social Security, we show the world what we value. We show that we're a country that cares for those who built this nation, that believes in fairness, that believes in security for all. His words cut through the air like a beacon of truth. This fight, it's not just about one generation's future, it's about the future of America itself. This is about ensuring that America remains a place where everyone, no matter their background, no matter how many obstacles they face, has a fair chance to succeed. It's about making sure that when you've worked your whole life, when you've given everything for your family and your country, you don't have to face old age alone and afraid. Biden's expression grew more intense as he looked into the camera, speaking directly to the hearts of the American people. The attack on Social Security is not just an attack on a program. It's an attack on the very heart of who we are as a people. It's an attempt to strip away the basic decency that holds our nation together. And I won't stand by and let that happen. Not on my watch. He took a breath, gathering his thoughts, the weight of the moment clear in his face. This isn't just a victory for Social Security. This is a victory for justice. For humanity. For the values that make us who we are. It's a victory for every senior who wakes up every morning knowing they can make ends meet. For every working family that depends on their paychecks to stay afloat. For every person in this country who believes in the promise of a secure future. He paused again, letting the words resonate. This is what we fight for. We fight for fairness. We fight for dignity. We fight for the belief that no one, no matter their circumstances, should be left behind. This is what America stands for. And this fight, it's far from over. But today we've reminded ourselves why we fight. Because America is a place that takes care of its own. America is a place where everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest senior, deserves to live with dignity. And as long as I'm here, I'll keep fighting for that promise. Biden's voice softened, but the resolve in it remained. This victory, this moment, belongs to all of us. To everyone who believes in a fairer, more just America. To the millions who have worked tirelessly to build this country and deserve to retire with peace of mind. To all the families who depend on Social Security to stay afloat. This is your victory. He leaned forward slightly, his tone more personal, more intimate. I've spent my whole life fighting for the people of this country. For the ones who don't have a voice in the halls of power, for the ones who are told time and time again that their struggles don't matter. But let me tell you something, your struggles matter. Your lives matter. And as long as I'm here, we're going to make sure that America remains the land of opportunity, the land of fairness, and the land of security for every single person who calls this country home. With that, Biden stood tall, his voice filled with quiet strength. In the end, it wasn't about political points. It was about protecting what matters most, the promise of a secure future for all Americans. And with that, we remind ourselves why we fight, because we believe in the promise of a better tomorrow. And together, we're going to make sure that promise is never broken. The room fell into a reflective silence, the weight of his words settling over the nation like a call to action. As Biden left the stage, his face illuminated with a quiet sense of pride, the world knew this wasn't just a victory for Social Security, it was a victory for justice, humanity, and the values that define America. The fight wasn't over. But Biden had shown the world what real leadership looked like. And in doing so, he had reignited the spirit of the nation. The battle for Social Security was more than just a debate, it was a fight for the future of millions of Americans. And in that moment, Joe Biden didn't just defend a policy, he defended a promise. A promise that every American, no matter their age or background, deserves the dignity and security they've earned. He showed us that when we stand together, when we fight for what's right, we can protect the very values that make this country great. But this fight isn't over. Cruz's attacks on Social Security won't stop here. They're already planning their next move, and we can't afford to let them win. The future of millions is on the line, and it's up to all of us to make sure that the promise of Social Security remains unbroken. If you believe in fighting for what's right, if you believe in protecting Social Security for the next generation, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with your friends, your family, your neighbors, spread the word far and wide. We need everyone in this fight. We need to make sure our voices are heard, that we stand together to defend the most vulnerable in our society. Join the movement to preserve America's promise. Because when we fight for Social Security, we fight for justice. We fight for dignity. And we fight for the future of this country. The battle may be far from over, but today, we've reminded ourselves what it means to fight for what truly matters. Let's keep that fight going. Subscribe now, share this video, and be part of a movement that will shape the future for generations to come. Together, we will protect Social Security. Together, we will protect America's promise.